Yeah, I just did that. Welcome everybody to our, what is it, like 6th week or something like that. Been doing this a while. So administrative stuff first, and then we'll get to the lecture. So I suppose just like stop the share for now and just do this. So I've gotten a bunch of questions about the grading for the class, so I'll answer them now that we're like halfway through. Again, all of the assignments are optional. You can earn 5 points by showing up in person or by showing up to the Zoom call with your camera on. You can also earn 2 points for attendance with your camera off. There's something like 460 points available in the whole class. Each point corresponds to 1% of your grade. Earn 90 of them to get an A- or 95 or whatever to get an A. And this is important because your midterm is coming up next week. The 2 tests for this class, the midterm and the final, they're both optional, just like every other assignment. But if you have not been attending, doing the write-ups or engaging on the discussion board, which there are several people who that is true of, I highly recommend taking the test. Now, even if you have been doing all of that, you can still take the test if you'd like to, right? That every assignment, including tests, are not just like grade churning machines, but they're opportunities for you to, like test your own education and to study more and have some like feedback from me and all this. So if you want to take the opportunity and use it, and you may not need to, that's totally welcome as well. The option goes in both directions for better and worse. Now, I haven't put grades in for the discussions. I've kept pretty well on top of the write-ups because it could get overwhelming. So I've been trying to do those as they come in. But with the discussions, they're really irritating to grade because of the way I've set it up, which is good. I mean, that's deliberate, but it's just, it's hard for me because it's a lot of back and forth. And then I'm like, there's been a lot of discussion, which is also absolutely fantastic. By the way, I read through all the discussions and they've been really cool. So there's a lot of talk of like identity crisis and like really awful problematics of thinking and like, I don't know what to think anymore. That this like feeling is philosophy working. That's like the job is being done. You're doing it right if this is what you're feeling. So the goal is not to leave having memorized that a squared plus b squared equals c squared and that you can measure the internal angles of a triangle using sine and cosine and tangent, but rather that you have shook up the foundational beliefs, those things that you thought you took for granted, right? In the simplest conceptual parts of our everyday lives, you shake those things a little bit and it ripples out. And if it doesn't shake, at least it attunes a sensitivity to the rest of your everyday life. And so having a crisis of identity about who or what you are, like what self-identity consists in, this is a good thing because it's only really kind of an armchair conceptual matter that doesn't really affect how you go to work or how you go to school, what grades you get unless you're in this class. Your like material success isn't dependent on whether or not you decide that you are your mind or your body, or just what matters is survival. But what the product of this class is, right? Like what Russell says is the non-tangible, non-material effect that having that concept of identity shook has on the rest of your lives, the sensitivity to dogmatisms in thinking, to taking critical perspectives and to being sensitive to critical perspectives from others, even if they're differing from your viewpoint. So I'm seeing all this in the discussion board. It's really great. That was a side note. It's just like, I'm proud of you guys. So like, good job. But the before the midterm, so this weekend I'll do it. I'm going to go through the discussion posts posted up to either Saturday or Sunday, whenever I get around to doing it. And I will record the points that you guys have earned by engaging on the discussion board up to this point. That does not mean that those discussion boards are no longer like open for grades. You can always post to them, like you can earn up to I think it's like 10 points per discussion board week. You can always earn those points through the end of the semester. The recording of the grades now is just like clerical so that you guys know whether or not you feel you should take a test for your grade or not. So that'll happen this weekend. So by Saturday or Sunday, you'll have your completely updated grade in the grade book. If you have questions about why I've graded the way I have or how grades work, always, I know it's like, this is semi-experimental, like I've done this class before, but it's still like a new thing and it's different than the way most classes are set up. So it can be a little strange and complicated. Work with me, I'll work with you and we'll get it worked out if there are confusions. But yeah, next week, we won't have a regular lecture. We'll have a midterm review. So you guys will bring questions about the midterm and ask them and I'll answer them. And I probably won't record that Zoom session, but I will run the Zoom session. So if you want to like attend the live review through Zoom, you can do that. But it won't be like one of our asynchronous lectures. So people who are taking the class asynchronously, you guys will just like tune in 2 weeks from today for the next lecture, which I think is free will, which is a fun one. Do like determinism and indeterminism and all that. So I think that's all the administrative stuff. Any questions about midterm grades, discussion board posts, existential crises? Yeah.
Do we have class on fall break? Is that just like leftover from?
Oh. Do I have, it's probably left over from the Zoom meeting. Because the syllabus is from last year, but I hope I redid the dates right.
Yeah, I think it's just because it's repeating, it still shows up as
If the Zoom meeting shows up, it's because I set it up as repeating every week. But do I have fall break?
The midterms the day before.
Oh, good. Then fall break falls in between our classes.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Then that was probably deliberate. I don't remember making that deliberate, but if that's how it falls, then I probably did that on purpose. Good job past me. Okay. Any other questions? Fall break, we shouldn't have class. If there is class, then I'll have to readjust things and that would be slightly awkward, but I'll look into that more after class. Anybody online? Are we good online? 1 thumb up, 2, 3, 4. Okay, cool. Lots of thumbs. Excellent. So let's get started. Very slowly. Where's my PowerPoint? Okay, cool. So from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Robert Louis Stevenson, it was on my moral side and in my own person that I had learned to recognize the thorough and primitive duality of man. I saw that of the two natures that contended in the field of my consciousness, even if I could rightly be said to be wither, it was only because I was radically both. It was the curse of mankind that these incongruous halves were thus bound together, that in the agonized womb of consciousness, these polar twins should be continuously struggling. I think this is like the realization that he comes to sort of at the end of the novel after murdering a small girl and terrorizing London. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, this realization, this question, the goodness and the badness of human nature, this duality of two halves, the incongruous parts of being human. Oh, Rachel, that's a good question. There's no points for attendance at the review session. That's like, it's optional and no points for that. So these incongruous halves of us, there's a good half, Dr. Jekyll, and a bad half, Mr. Hyde. At least this seems to be our intuitions, and intuitions dating historically way far back, right? To very ancient times, early China, BCE era times. and dealt with over and over throughout the years. So when we wonder whether human nature is good or bad, we often look to human action. We see what do humans operate like, and when we think in that way, it really kind of depends on what side of the bed we woke up in the morning. If we choose to think about the happy, lovey concerts that we go to, or the traffic we sit in on the way home from those concerts, right? Whether or not we think human nature is good or bad. Here in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, they're separated as two, but the realization is that it's really all integrated. It's kind of an interesting thought. But what we're going to discuss today is this feeling, sort of each half, the Jekyll in us and the Hyde in us, and which is more natural, which is deeper, what's the foundation of human nature, what stands at the bottom, the Hyde in us or the Jekyll in us. So before we talk about the readings, the arguments that we saw from Mengzi and Xunzi, we're going to do some history of early China. Don't try too hard to read this. This is more like for your resource because it's so tiny. Like, don't strain your eyes. This is like a resource for you after to like look at the PowerPoint slides, and if you want these timelines, they're there for you. I'll tell you the story of the timelines, which begins in the Shah dynasty a long time ago, 3000 to 1500 BC. So everything that we know about the Shah dynasty is mythological. Now, this was during the Bronze Age, so we have some bronze artifacts from this time period, like later on in the time period, not like very early Shah dynasty. But the Shah dynasty is sort of where, mythologically speaking, Chinese culture begins, right? So, and it's in the Shah dynasty that the mythos of the sage kings, the sage rulers, the sage emperors, takes off, and thus inspires like the rest of early Chinese philosophy in looking up to these guys, these sage kings. Basically, early Chinese philosophy from the Warring States period and on is referencing back to this early mythological time, these leaders who established the culture and society of China with their great virtue, and now we ought to like look back and learn the lessons of their virtue, and this is how we ought to guide our actions today. So this is where we get our five emperors, the sage kings, the first three of which, Yao, Shun, and Yu, are attributed to the Shah dynasty. So it was said in the Shah dynasty that, and the reason that there was like no actual China or Chinese culture before the mythology really begins, is that there were massive floods. So whoever lived in the East Asian steppe would move around, right, from place to place, and then get flooded out of the place and move to the next one. And Emperor Yu, the third in the line here, the son of Emperor Shun, is famous for taming the floods. That Yu takes 13 years to build levees or something, right, that controls the floodwaters and fights away the evil beasts that threaten mankind, and introduces agriculture to China, and for the very first time creates the Shah dynasty. Now, Yu's, I think, son, Zhe here, one of the two tyrants, right? These are like the guys that we look back on and say, these are like the most evil people in all of Chinese history, Zhe and Zhou. But Zhe, Yu's son, he's a decadent and takes advantage of the power of his dynasty and his father's, and loses what ends up being called the mandate of heaven. This idea introduced by Emperor Tong in the Shang dynasty, who overthrows Zhe and says, look, the reason that you've lost power, the reason that your dynasty is now over and it's time for the new Shang dynasty, is because the will of heaven, the mandate of heaven, is with me. I am the new ruler of all of the land and the world, right? And so Emperor Tong begins the Shang dynasty. And again, this era in very early Chinese history is completely shrouded in mystery, mythos, and the unknown. Really, all that we have from these two periods of time, as I mentioned, are bronze artifacts and oracle bones. So oracle bones are some of the earliest known sources of writing in the world, in fact. And what they worked, the way that they worked is you would take like a turtle shell and inscribe a bunch of runes inside of the turtle shell and then like throw the shell on the floor, and think like how it cracked or how it like the position and space that it landed in would tell the prophets how to advise the emperors in ruling their kingdom, sort of like was it augury, is the like watching how birds fly, right? This is an ancient Greek tradition, the way that birds manifest or move is a huge part of Greek mythology in deciding or understanding how the gods are sending their messages to mankind. And then of the bronze work, there's a lot of, from what I understand, pots and stuff that were commissioned when one king or baron defeated another. And so you would commission a bronze work of art that says, on this day, this leader was victorious in their battle against the evil tribe over there, or something like that. And so this is really all of the like physical artifacts of history that we have from this period of time. So it's like I said, we have oracle bones and bronze, trophies basically from this time, and not much else. It's not until the Zhou dynasty that we start to get written records for the very first time in early China. So again, there's Emperor Zhou in the Shang, and he gets overthrown by Wen, whose son Wu then takes over. And there's this period of, it's like a great renaissance. This is, again, like the first period in which there's written history, the consolidation of, as you can see, even territory, and central government becomes a powerful and potent tool for organizing people. And you have a golden age, truly, in the early Zhou dynasty. But as is what happens to all dynasties and empires, it enters a period of decadence and decline known as the summer and autumn period, where the Zhou dynasty is sort of split into its native territories or states, and those territories begin to secede from the Zhou dynasty and declare their own sovereignty. Now, by the time we get to the Warring States period of China, which is where all of our interested thinkers begin to appear, the Zhou dynasty had been split into East and West, and then eventually completely fractured into like this, how many are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, like these 8 different dynasties, 8 different massive powers levying for control of the East Asian steppe and the early Chinese hegemony. And there's no more golden age. There's still a Zhou empire, but it's in complete decline, and everybody is at war, conscripting soldiers, fighting. There's bloody murder everywhere, war, and a real Game of Thrones like situation, right, where everybody is politically and militarily maneuvering against one another for, again, control and for power. And it's in this period of like total war in China that philosophy begins and takes off. What I find to be interesting is that it's at like an analog time to the beginning and development of philosophy in ancient Greece. So in the West and in the East, philosophers at least are beginning to write down and develop their cosmological ideas. The Western philosophers tended to be more interested in like what we would call metaphysics now. And there might be some metaphysics in early China, but it tends to really deal with like human life and virtue and value, like how to live. Though it is dependent on the Tao, which we'll talk about, which you could interpret as being sort of a metaphysical object of cosmology. Anyways, just interesting that there's a historical parallel in timeline of the development of philosophy in the East and the West. And in the East, it occurs during this period of great war and strife and agony for the people. But in this war and strife, there's a philosophical flourishing. We have at the very earliest date, Laozi, who may not have ever existed. There's no really telling. We don't have historical records of Laozi. There's no reason to believe that even the Tao Te Ching was written by a single author. In fact, it's kind of a general principle of the literature today to understand the Tao Te Ching as not written by a single author, but as a single coherent work. And then early copies of the Tao Te Ching, there's the Tao Te Ching, which is Tao, the way, De, virtue, and then there's De Tao Ching as well. So like the bamboo strips on which it was inscribed have been inverted, and some early archaeological discoveries of it. It's kind of an interesting thing. So when you study the Tao Te Ching, it's a total mess and mystery. It's really hard to work with because it's not in any way, even like conceptually, a static text that's analyzable. Every line can be interpreted in about 8 different ways as well. Anyways, Laozi is attributed to writing the Tao Te Ching, and have Xunzi, also Confucius, right? So Confucius is the Latinization of Xunzi. Zi is just like master, right? There's Mozi, who's an interesting character himself. Mo just means tattooed one. So the thought is that this guy was like a prisoner who got like a tattoo prison on his face and then becomes this philosophical leader. And the Mohists are really interesting. We have a lot of fragments from them, and they dealt with logic quite a bit. And I think the logic stuff that they dealt with, as far as I understand it, is really fragmented. But they also were all about ethics and military defense. So they were like this group of warlike philosophical zealots who would go from town to town that was being besieged by a greater, larger power, and they would occupy that town, build walls and defenses, and promise a Pyrrhic victory to the attacker of that city. Super cool, right? So imagine just like a bunch of militant philosophers with cudgels and a whole lot of interesting ideas about defensive strategy coming to your town and saying, look, we don't care about you, but we care about the bigger guy beating you up, so we're going to make that not happen to you. And this is what they would do. They were way into defense and nonviolence, but they practiced, they were like ready and willing to go to war for the sake of their beliefs. It's like, I don't think there's any other philosophical school that was so militant, but also like kind of cool and virtuous as well. So it seems to me. And there's Xunzi, who is another Taoist, interesting sort of development on the Taoist philosophy in the Tao Te Ching from Laozi. There's Mengzi, who we read for today, also Latinized as Mencius. Xunzi, another Confucian who we read for today. Hanfeizi, Li Si, these guys are sort of honorable mentions. They're the legalists. They're students of Xunzi. We'll talk about them a little bit later today as well. But we have all of these huge figures appearing within a like 302 to 300 period of years during the strife of the Warring States period. And all of them contribute immensely to philosophical progress and are hugely influential historically to the philosophy of early China and going forward, pretty much all of Chinese philosophy. So as I mentioned, we have the Taoists, we have Xunzi and Laozi. There's another sort of important Taoist, Liezi, but he comes way later in the Han Dynasty, around 300 AD, and he may not exist either, but he's a cool one. The Tao Te Ching is written in poetic form. The Xunzi is written in like stories and arguments, and the Liezi is a bunch of parables, which I find really interesting. They're fun to read. Anyways, we have Taoists in this period. We have Confucians. Confucius, Mencius, Xunzi. We have the Moists, just Mozi, and the legalists who fall out of the Confucian school, out of Xunzi. So all of this really begins with Confucius. Now, like Confucius and Lao Tzu sort of are their own form of beginnings, but for the sake of what we read for today, our discussion of human nature to come, this all begins with Confucius. So all of these guys, all of these philosophers are interested in the Tao, which means the way is typically how it's translated. There's about 600 different ways of translating this one term. And it's an enigmatic term, but it is essential because the Tao, the way, the first line of the Tao Te Ching is something like the Tao that can be spoken of is not the true Tao, right? So it's a little awkward even trying to describe it, but the idea is that there is an in principle form of nature that is inscribed or imbued within us that will guide us towards right action, towards right being, towards living well. Now, the Tao Te Ching, the Tao that is spoken of is not the true Tao, is completely contrary to the Tao as Confucius understands it. Confucius believed that there is a very specific form of the way as it operates through us and as we can participate in, and that is through ritual and virtue, practicing as the sage kings did. And what you see in Confucius is that he grows up in this like period of awful strife and sees the political decadence and wants to say, look, why are we fighting with each other? We're acting like a bunch of babies crying and screaming at one another. Let's be like our mature forefathers who ran a Renaissance and golden age of early China. Let's be like those sage kings in the early Zhou dynasty and even early in the Shang and Shah dynasty. So get rid of this decadence. Let's be like our elders were. And the way to acting this way, to incorporating the Tao as Confucius understood it, is through, again, ritual practice, through respect of tradition, filial piety, loving your parents, respecting them, right? And this is a development of or response to Taoism as I understand it. So if Lao Tzu and even the I Ching are predecessors to Confucius, then Confucius is living in a time where he hears that the Tao that can be spoken of is not the true Tao, and there's all of this like act naturally, don't really think too much about it, but then around him he sees political decline and decadence and war, and thinks, well, no, that can't actually be the real Tao. The real Tao must be something that really has actual positive products for our actions, our interactions, and our political lives. And that requires a set of rules, a set of values that are strict and easy to follow. So this means no new fancy music, respect your family and elders, respect ritual propriety, always keep your elbows off the table, put your knives on the left, your forks on the right. Don't chew with your mouth open or do, right, that you're following the rules. And if we all just follow the rules, wouldn't we all get along so well? As long as we follow the way, we keep our mats straight and pointed to the east. And these values of tradition and ritual spit out certain sets of virtues that are really important for the Confucian project. So there's Ren, which is benevolence. So the idea of Ren is that it's sort of like more than just compassion in being benevolent, but it's sort of like an extension. And this is really developed in the Mengzi. But the idea of Ren is that insofar as I love one person, I know what it's like to love in general, and so can love more than just that one person. By loving my parents, I can love elders generally, right? And then you get this sort of like broadening scope of concentric circles of compassion until you're completely generalized and you have a benevolent nature towards all of humanity. There's zhe, which is wisdom, the idea of sensitivity, of understanding the Tao and why ritual and tradition, etc., is so important. There's yi, which is righteousness, which is sort of Aristotle has Aristotle considers anger to be a virtue as long as it's within the right means. So it's not too much anger, not too little anger, but just the right amount. That in righteousness we are motivated to and strive for what is good for the way. And Shin, which is faithfulness, right? So we're faithful to our projects and to our values, to the importance of the Tao and tradition. And then, of course, above all, there's Li, which is proper right. This is, I've been using the word ritual a lot, but proper right and ritual is Li, and this is where the head of Exodia, right? It's what like controls the rest of the limbs. But ritual practice is that through which all of the other virtues fall out, and we become better people. So Confucius is never hired as the state leader because when you were a philosopher at this time, the goal was to get hired on into the company of one of these state leaders and to advise them, to be like worm tongue sitting in the chair just behind the king and whispering your beliefs or whatever. And Confucius never makes it. He doesn't get hired. He sort of like lives. He's a popular figure, but never quite breaks through. And it's really his influence that matters. And he's called the first great sage in China. And there's a Confucian temple that there's all sorts of Confucian temples actually all throughout China that honor Confucius for his influence. And the Confucian influence has a huge, massive role in Chinese education and cultural development, I think pretty much up until Mao, although my understanding of more contemporary Chinese history is pretty poor. But I think it's like until Mao, you had to take a state test where you like memorized a bunch of passages out of the Analects, Confucius's writings. And that was how you like would get jobs at all, is you had to pass your state test first. So Confucianism, the Analects, is developed, although Confucius himself never succeeded in the way that he would have hoped that he might. His influence is absolutely massive through all of Chinese history, and remains so. And then we have his students. Now, Mengzi wasn't Confucius's student directly. He grew up very poor about a century after Confucius's death, though it's said that he studied under Confucius's grandson, Zisi. So Mengzi makes it. He does actually succeed and becomes the advisor to an emperor, a ruling king of, I think, the Qin dynasty, who keeps Mengzi in their pay. Qi, it's the state of Qi. And as the story goes, Mengzi is the advisor for the state of Qi, for the king here, and then the military generals and the ruler, the king, says, "Hey, can we go to war with this town to the south? Would that be all right with you?" And he says, "Yeah, there is a way to engage in just warfare with this other people. So go ahead." But as soon as they do go ahead, the militants begin killing non-combatants, and war is as war does, and innocent people die. And Mengzi sees all of this, and he sees that he sanctioned the actions that led to this, and so resigns his position in shame and withdraws from public life. And before all this happens, he's writing what we now call the Mengzi, just like a collection of his writings, sayings, and teachings. he develops the Confucian school. He takes the Confucian project that was begun in the Analects and really develops it philosophically. That he takes what Confucius says and gives much more substance to many of the arguments, and for the first time discusses human nature as an important feature of what it is that we need to understand as a means towards living the right sort of Tao. So he's a Confucian. He's interested in the ritual, right, and all of those other virtues. But he is so in his own way, insofar as he develops the project and does so famously. He's called the second great sage for his developments. And as I mentioned, like Ren, benevolence, right, spreading out this like sort of it's like trickle down love or whatever. Yeah. This is Mengzi's idea. And his sort of expression of universal compassion, universal Ren for everybody. And then you have Xunzi, who may have been contemporary with Mengzi for like 10 years or so, right? But he would have been too young to have interacted with Mengzi at all. His early life is shrouded in mystery. Not much is known. Sima Chan does little to illuminate. Sima Chan is sort of like the Herodotus of early China. It's like storyteller, historian guy. And Xunzi is sometimes called the third great sage, sometimes not, because for many centuries he was sort of like, if not forgotten about, then like denigrated and disrespected as an apostate of Confucianism, because he shakes the Mengzian developments to Confucius, says human nature is bad and we don't actually have the capacity to universally love in the way that Mengzi thinks so. And it's this kind of thinking that inspires the legalist school in entertaining philosophical and political practices that lead to some of early China's bloodiest and most brutal history. So Xunzi's two students, Laozi and Han Feizi, become advisors to emperors and kings in their own right. And the legalist school is all about order, right? In following the rules and making people follow the rules by whatever means necessary, right? So you come up with brutal punishments. You rule with a stick and not really a carrot at all. And again, this leads to a really bloody part of history, but also like a consolidation. The ending of the Warring States period is enabled through the legalist philosophical practice. And the Qin dynasty takes over, which rules until I think the Han dynasty is what follows. But it doesn't happen, this consolidation of power in the Qin dynasty, without really brutal, awful tactics and political tyrannism. And so looking back, the Han dynasty follow up to the Qin, sort of like say, Xunzi, you suck because you were the reason that we had this like period of awful, bloody nastiness. Your students did it. Now, you should read Laozi's Wikipedia page for a really good time. It's super interesting. So like if you're into Game of Thrones, imagine that storyline condensed into a few paragraphs, and then on Laozi's page, it is nutty, the back and forth. So just as like a spoiler, Laozi works for one dynasty, Han Feizi, his student and his fellow like comrade, colleague, and friend from their days in the academy with Xunzi. They like develop their philosophy together, right? Han Feizi works for the Han dynasty. I don't know. And anyways, the Laozi says, "Hey, Emperor, what you should do is invite Han Feizi over as like a peace gesture, like, hey, you should send your advisor to us and we'll work it out together, because we were old colleagues, old schoolmates, right?" So the emperor says, great idea, and sends the invitation, and Han Feizi comes and arrives in the other dynasty, and Laozi immediately puts him in jail and says, look, you better just kill yourself, here's some poison. And he does. Yeah, so like he like convinces his old schoolmate friend to kill himself, and then eventually like this leads to the fall of that dynasty, and it's real trouble. Li Si himself was betrayed by another advisor in the court of the young child emperor. And I think, I don't remember this, it's been a while, but I think he was forced to the punishment that he invented, like I think it was called the 5 tortures or something. It's like being drawn and quartered on top of whole other slew of awful torturous things to have your death penalty. But yeah, super interesting history and Wikipedia page there. Anyways, that's just like sort of a taste of the brutality and nastiness of the follow-up to the legal school. Now, that said, there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on in legalism. So don't think like it's a like bad philosophy or philosophical system or whatever. It just, it has a history, right, that is not looked well upon. So Xunzi inspires this and isn't super popular because of it. But he is a major development of Confucianism in contrast to Mengzi, and so is, you know, up there in fame. So the topic of today's lecture is whether or not human nature is good or bad. And in most typical intro to philosophy classes, if you're asking this question, you're going to be reading Locke, Rousseau, and Hobbes, even in like an English class, probably in high school, where Rousseau is saying, look, everybody just run naked through the forest and have a great time and we'll just kind of get along. Hobbes says, yeah, until we start murdering each other, and its state of nature is real ugly and nasty, and life is brutish and short, and it's the strongest who wins and survives. And Locke is a nice blend of the two, that yeah, we mostly get along, but we don't want to have to be our own judge, jury, and executioner. It's a lot of emotional work, so we sign a social contract to kind of distribute that responsibility. In the early Chinese way of understanding things, I think it's more philosophically interesting than that like pretty typical back and forth. And there's a whole lot of awful issues with state of nature arguments, like are they even coherent? Anyways, I think this is a more fruitful and interesting sort of contextually path to the question, is human nature good or is it bad? What is human nature? So for Mengzi, the answer is that it's good, that at bottom we are good. And his reason for this is for the Siduan, the 4 sprouts. And then there's also reflection as an important concept. But for Mengzi, within all of us are these sprouts, what he calls sprouts. And this is a metaphor, it's an agricultural metaphor, but it's an important one. It carries a lot of meaning with it. So as he says, the 4 sprouts of hearts, namely 1, the feeling of compassion, 2, that of disdain, 3, that of deference, and 4, that of approval and disapproval. Inherently endowed to all human beings, each heart constitutes the foundation of different kinds of core virtues, such as benevolence, righteousness, propriety, and wisdom. So these sprouts are not themselves virtues. They are sort of the makings, the beginnings of the eggs and butter and flour of the virtue cake that you gotta bake, right, eventually. But they're in all of us. We're all born with all of the ingredients that we need to become good. And as he's going to argue, those ingredients will naturally push themselves towards the becoming good rather than the alternative, just sort of living in wantedness and evil. So here it's important to note that the propriety, as he talks about, isn't just like treating each other right, but ritual propriety. Right? So what the sprouts inspire us to do, and the way that we develop the sprouts, is by, again, in the Confucian way of doing it, following ritual and tradition. Not just being kind to each other and not being jerks, but doing it in the very specific right sort of way, as Confucius taught us and as the Sage Kings inspire through their example. The sprouts, again, are not full virtues, and they're fragile, right? They're sprouts. They're not full trees. They're not woody bushes. They're not hardy. They're sprouts. They're easy to step on, easy to overcome. And if you don't treat them right, they will wither and die and diminish. So even though we all have them, right? They need to be strengthened and extended. They need to be given food and fuel. They need to be given their nitrogen and potassium, and they need to be given water if they are to actually flourish in the way that, again, a plant flourishes. So this is, as I mentioned, an agricultural metaphor. You can't rush the growth of a sprout. You can't just feed it all of the nitrogen and potassium. You can't just overwater. In fact, number one cause of household plant death, who knows what it is? Yeah, it's overwatering. Number one cause of household plant death is overwatering. And what happens is you put enough water in the soil, like when you put your hand in, like you take a bath and then it gets all, that happens for texture so that you can like grip while you're underwater, like, like a frog. It's kind of cool. It's like an adaptive trait. Anyways, imagine your roots, the roots of your plants doing that, and then they rot away and then the plant dies. So similarly, you can't rush the development and growth of the sprouts. They need to grow naturally in their own sort of way, but we give them the right conditions. We treat the soil and we treat the microclimate in which they grow. That's like our souls or whatever. And we give them what they need in the right proportion with which they need it, right? And this is how we grow and develop the sprouts, how we turn those sprouts into full, robust virtues. But complacency isn't allowed either. You can't just like wait around and wait for them to grow themselves. They need to be given some care and treatment. We need to like recognize that we have the sprouts, that we ought to be striving towards the development of full virtue. And if we don't, then again, we're making another kind of mistake. So the seed one as sprouts is the metaphor for the beginnings of virtue, and the seeds of being good implanted in all of us naturally is an important one, because it gives us all of these extra little features of the concept. Don't rush it, but don't leave it alone. Take care of it and let them flourish on their own right. Eventually they'll bolt and produce flowers and become virtues. So one of the three main features of the sprouts is universality. So everybody has the sprouts. From this, we can see that if one is without the feeling of compassion, one is not human. So if you're human, then you have sprouts. That's a pretty strong conditional claim. If one is without the feeling of disdain, one is not human. If one is without the feeling of deference, one is not human. If one is without the feeling of approval and disapproval, one is not human. So what Mengzi is doing is he's giving us premises here. He's saying, look, that if you're human, then you have all of these traits, and these traits are the four sprouts that, again, develop themselves into virtues. And there's a strong insistence on the universality of the connection between sprouts and human nature. People's having these four sprouts is like they're having four limbs. You can run over a sprout, you can chop off a limb, you're still a human, but you're missing a vital, essential part of what you could be, what you are. And your human nature will be affected in a corresponding way by the loss or editing or change or whatever of one of these sprouts. Whoops. Pretend you didn't see that slide. You'll see it at the end of this anyways. So Mencius's articulation of the feeling of compassion in 2a6, which we read for today, suggests the two following features: that it's not just that the sprouts are universal, but they also have sort of an immediate receptivity or power within us, which is just to say that what is natural in us is inspired immediately through interaction with the world. That by interacting with the world at all, by perceiving it, by being in it, we have feelings of approval and disapproval. We have feelings of disdain. We have feelings of righteousness, right? That these sprouts operate always in our interaction with the world as long as they're present in us. Now, they're not necessarily always present in us, right? We can rot the root. We can run them over. Like that. Did I include the Ox Mountain passage? Do you guys remember reading about the Ox? Yeah. I did. Yeah. So the Ox Mountain passage, the story goes, there's a whole bunch of trees on this mountain. It's really pretty. but a town starts up nearby and they need to build houses, and so they chop down all the trees, and then there's secondary succession, right? This is the development of shrub life and plants where trees used to be, which tender the soil so that trees can then grow again, which is tertiary succession. And so there's secondary succession in this now like clear cut section of the mountain, but then the village has their oxen walk all over the plants, and so even though the life is trying to reestablish itself, it's trying to succeed the loss of the natural habitat, they're trampled, the plants are trampled, and then after the oxen leave, the town or the hillside becomes barren, that by treading over these sprouts too much, we kill them, we lose the ability to regrow them, and we have infertile soil and the inability to continue to grow more. So that the sprouts, although they're universal, they're not universally universal, meaning that like they're all in us at the start, but they can get killed off if we don't take care of them in the right sort of way, if we allow them to be trampled and chopped down for wanted needs and desires. But they're also immediate, they operate as they will. They are also, importantly, insofar as they're immediate, a source of moral motivation. They're kind of like a wellspring of agency. They cause us to move to action. And this, so that with universality, with immediacy, we can't help but to operate through the sprouts. And the fact that the sprouts move us to action with a certain direction, so action for the sake of disdain or for approval and disapproval or for righteousness or whatever, right, is that we get an argument for human nature being good. We don't just have a bunch of premises about like what sprouts are and what human nature is or whatever, but we get a real argument that humans are moved to do good universally and naturally right off the bat, as long as we are given the right sort of world to be in to inspire that kind of action. So, thought experiment. The child and the well. This one made me giggle. So Mengzi has us consider a child in a well. There you are, bending over. It's not your child. I don't know what you're doing, passing gas or something. Maybe you're, I don't know what. Yeah, maybe bowing to the baby.
Yeah.
But oh no, you've distracted the baby and it falls into the well. Oh no. So you see it, right? And then you feel alarm and pain. Oh God, that baby just fell into a well. Dear God, no. And then you feel compassion. I got to help this baby. Where's the bucket? Get in the bucket, baby. And you're motivated to act. You run to the well to save the baby. And what Mengzi says of this example is that, I think, is that everybody would act this way. Anybody who sees a little baby crawl into a well and fall down it will be motivated to go save it, or at least they'll have that feeling of, like, oh God, no, like something terrible has happened. And this reaction is, insofar as it's universal, it moves us to act to save the baby. Insofar as we all feel the alarm, the motivation, the compassion upon perceiving this event is evidence of the fact, empirical evidence, good argumentative proof of the goodness of human nature. So what do you think? Are we convinced human nature's good?
Decent argument, I think.
Okay.
I don't know if I'm convinced.
We respect the game, but maybe not the goal. You're getting philosophical. How about online? What do you guys think? You think no? Do you think yes? You don't have thoughts?
No, I don't think this proves anything.
Doesn't prove anything. Why do you think that?
Who's to say that? I mean, like, this is one thing of human nature, right? It's just compassion. Like, to you can't just say everyone would do it.
Good. Yeah. So when we give empirical thought experiments like this, you could say it. Look, everybody will feel alarm and pain, but some people might go, "Ha ha, that baby fell in a well." And there's nothing to say that that's logically impossible in the construction of the thought experiment itself. So this is a good objection.
Scientifically test that. At least you can sort of see someone's brain react in shock, in shock or stuff like that. So could actually kind of test at least that part.
Yeah. It makes me think a little bit of like a Clockwork Orange, when they like reprogram his brain, right? That you show the right kind of image over and over to someone, and they're gonna, even if they're like awful, like his character is, it'll still have an effect. And that might be enough for Mengzi's argument too, that even if you are one of those people, it's like, haha, baby fell in that well, what a loser, what a stupid baby, wasn't it thinking, an idiot.
I remember doing, I did a research paper about a study in high school that they showed that 6-week-old babies showed this same reaction, kind of trying to prove that humans were innately good.
That if a baby sees another baby fall down a well,
Not this exact thing, but they were using puppets and things, and they were able to watch their reactions to certain puppets being helped versus hurt.
Yeah,
Reacted similarly.
There's a lot of interesting infant studies out there. And a lot of them are controversial because they all show sorts of different things. Like the kid cares more about the look of a creature than the narrative involved, or the narrative doesn't have long-lasting effect. There's all sorts of funky, weird studies on kids and infants that have neat lessons. I personally don't know how to feel about infant studies. To infer from the behavior of a baby or a toddler to a general principle or explanation about humans in general seems specious to me, right? Because your brain is so different. I mean, if you leave a baby on its back too long, its head goes flat, right? That's a real thing. It just seems to me that's physical, of course, not like a mind thing, but the analogy of at least intuition seems pretty compelling to me. Inferring from baby to adult is a tough one. That said, it's still very interesting that you can find these sorts of reactions, and I think it's worth doing the studies. I think it's also worth being sensitive to the what's being proven or shown, right? But yeah, you throw a puppet down a well and a baby might feel, oh God, no, I liked that puppet, and then they'll cry and poop their pants, which is hopefully different from an adult. So this is Mengzi's big argument for human nature being good. But what about cases of moral failure, right? If human nature is good, then why do we screw up? Why are things bad? Why are we in a warring states period? Why is everybody trying to kill everybody, and especially non-combatants and innocents? Well, here we have Ox Mountain, right? That the ox walk over and graze on the vegetation on the hillside and eat it all away. And because it's just been used and worked up and worked over, there's no more fertile ground on this hillside. It goes barren. That if we overwork, if we don't treat the sprouts in the right way, if we don't give them the right conditions for survival, let alone for flourishing, then we have no hope. And the right conditions, says the good Confucian, is tradition, familial piety, filial piety, and living in the Tao the right sort of way. But then how do we cultivate ourselves, right? If we don't want to just be overwrought, if this is a worry or a concern, well, we do it through reflection. Benevolence, righteousness, propriety, and wisdom are not welded to us externally. We inherently have them. It is simply that we do not reflect upon them. Hence it is said, seek it and you will get it, abandon it and you will lose it, says Mengzi. So through reflection, through this contemplative practice, which is an underdeveloped notion, I think here, but an important one nonetheless. Through reflection, we contemplate upon the virtues that are implicit, intrinsic, inherent, built into us, the benevolence, righteousness, propriety, and wisdom of our actions. And it's through this reflection that we give the right sort of light and soil and nutrients to the sprouts such that they can grow and flourish. So here's the argument formalized. People's spontaneous, unreflective reactions are manifestations of how their nature is constituted, right? Which is just to say that how you react, like simplistic without influence, is a reflection of what you're like. And that seems to make sense. That's sort of pretty clear. 2, people have spontaneous, unreflective reactions of compassion for others that think baby on the well. Therefore, human nature is constituted in part by compassion for others, that our natural reactions are indicative of what our nature is. Our natural reactions are sometimes of compassion for babies falling in wells, hopefully not too often. And so human nature is thus in part constituted by compassion. Compassion for others is a virtue. And people also have spontaneous, unreflective reactions of deference, approval, and disapproval of other virtues, right? That we don't just have spontaneous reactions of compassion, but also these other sprouts, these other virtues or things that can become virtues. So human nature, therefore, is also constituted in part by disdain for what's shameful, of deference and approval and disapproval by the other virtues, the things that we naturally react to. So these other reactions are also virtues like compassion. The virtues mentioned in premise 3 and 6 are the most important ones. There's probably others, but these are the most important ones. So human nature is constituted by the most important virtues. These virtues are either the sole or primary constituents of human nature. If human nature is constituted solely by or primarily by the most important virtues, then human nature is good. Therefore, given the rest of the argument, human nature is good. So here we have a formalized proof set up with the aid of particular premises offered about like what our natural feelings are, how those feelings operate, and what the significance of those operations are in inference, meaning like if we have this naturally, spontaneously, then we can say it's part of human nature, that premise. All sort of set up through the Mengzi's storytelling and argumentation to give us a proof for human nature being good. What do you think about the proof? What's wrong with the argument?
He doesn't give like an exhaustive account of these reactions. He just names a few good ones and then proceeds, but there could be other ones that he's not mentioning that may or may not be good.
Good. So this is an objection to premise 8 then. These virtues are either the sole or primary constituents of human nature.
Yeah.
Right. And so these come from some passages, I think 683 is probably in there. But you might say, look, there's a whole lot of other really basic and potent human spontaneous reactions or emotions that are not so virtuous, but they're pretty ubiquitous, like being angry when we're hungry, get irritated when you haven't had your caloric intake for the day. That's not quite a virtue, that anger that comes from the irritation. But that's a pretty common one. So good, that's a good objection, premise 8. Anybody else? Objection to the argument? Or are you convinced? Is human nature good? No, it's not good. What's your objection?
I
I just think not everyone reacts this way, and he's just thinking about his own reaction, maybe.
Not everyone reacts this way. So this is an objection to the universality point, right? That not everybody has ingrained in them from birth these proclivities towards virtuous reaction, even if they're not virtues insofar as their proclivities quite yet. They have to be grown right. That there might be other proclivities that are pretty common. Yeah, good objection.
Adding on to that, I think people can actually be conditioned to react certain ways, and that could potentially like override the compassion that they have.
Yeah, so this is consistent. So the for everybody online, the objection was you can have your compassionate reactions overridden. This is the moral failure case that Mengzi is sensitive to, right? The Ox Mountain thing, that we all have the sprouts, but we're all not given fertile ground or the ability to treat them well. So human nature is still good, but we're not always seeds sown in the path of the development of those proclivities and sprouts to flourishing into true virtue.
The argument's pretty convincing.
Okay.
Like when I first read that part about like everyone will react to child falling down the well. That's actually a pretty good point. One thing you could way that you could argue with this though, that maybe someone has already sort of mentioned this, but people's first reactions aren't necessarily indicative of their core nature. Like you could definitely argue that what people do is their nature, or what they end up thinking is really what they
But your reaction isn't. Cool. So this is an objection to premise one. So the objection is that, look, it's not your reaction that is indicative of or reflective of human nature. Rather, it is the action that follows from, say, like the sum total of your reactions. Because, you know, like tragedy strikes and you think a million thoughts a second, and then it's the one that like strikes you as, okay, this is the right one to do. That's what is truly reflective of your nature. So it's not reaction, but it's action, right? So you might feel all sorts of strange and weird ways, but the strange and weird ways that matter are the ones that lead to action, and those actions may not always be good or virtuous actions. That is, say, universally in the case of like all humans. Otherwise, like, why would we have war and poverty and hunger and all that, right? Good objection. Premise one. How about online? Does anybody want to argue with the argument? What's wrong with it? Nothing is
P9 seems problematic because
okay.
he's stating that human nature is constituted solely from these most important virtues. So it's kind of implicitly saying that he's found out what human nature is.
Yeah, this is a good this is a good objection insofar as it's good empirical thinking. It's sort of the way that I imagine Hume would object to this argument, right? So Hume says, look, just because all of the ducks you've ever seen are white doesn't allow you to infer that all ducks are white. Same thing, like you see the sunrise every day, you're not allowed to infer the sun will rise tomorrow too. That's an actual like thing out in the world that isn't contingent on the structure of logic, but on the structure of nature, which is not inherent to logic. So similarly, you might say, look, even like granting all of the rest of the argument, like hypothetically speaking, let's grant all of the rest of the argument. Do we still want to grant the inference from the prevalence and importance of these reactive virtues spontaneously and universally in humankind to the fact that human nature is good? Is that inference valid? And if we object to premise 9, you might say, well, look, as was that Hawken? Was that your objection? Yeah, as Hawken objects, look, just because we've said that there is a, like we've granted everything about the argument, just because there's this like massive amount of evidence showing that we have this proclivity to good action, to virtue, etc. The inference to human nature being good is an unjustified one because there might be that one little thing that ruins it all, right? The bad apple rots away the bunch. And the prevalence and weight of these virtuous or sprout-like proclivities to good action are not themselves sufficient for the goodness of human nature. You might have all of that, and then also, like a little bit of evil too, and that little bit of evil is all it takes. Is that sort of what you're getting at, Hawken? Cool. Yeah, I think that's a great objection as well. So we've seen objections to premise 1, premise 9, premise 8. This is good. Anybody else before we move on?
Yeah, I've got something real quick.
Sure.
Who's to say that compassion in general is a good thing?
Who's to say compassional?
I mean, I feel like good is a pretty objective statement. And if I have ulterior motives to rescuing a baby falling in a well, does that make it bad? Or is it still good because I saved the baby?
Yeah, so this is getting at a deeper question. You're right, it's taken for granted that compassion is a good thing. And you might think, so that like the altruist is sort of a generally lauded hero in at least Western society. I think probably universally that to be an altruist is to be a good person, right? What about the altruist who goes too far? They're too altruistic. They're so altruistic that they give away all of their possessions, and then they walk up to a doctor's office and say, hey, suck all my organs out, give them to other people who need them more. Yeah, and then they're dead and gone. They're an empty corpse without organs, right? There is an excess. There is a case in which it's pretty clear that over altruism, over compassion is not so great, or like it's a little smelly. We don't like it that much.
On top of that, it kind of brought up the question, are you still seen as the hero if you choose to save one life over 1,000?
Yeah, so you could be compassionate for one person or compassionate for 1,000, and how you measure these depends on what your intuitions about goodness are. And it is, so that this is a good objection, Ethan, and it's a nice development. It is taken for granted that compassion and goodness are coextensive. But we might object to the, again, inference from compassion to goodness. So again, we could grant the whole argument, but we wouldn't get the inference to human nature is good. We would get the inference to human nature is compassionate. Whether or not that ends up being good depends on other arguments and decisions about what we think constitutes the moral normative sort of framework of good versus bad, which is something that we will do in about 4 weeks, I think 3 weeks. After free will, we get into ethics. So we'll deal with those questions. You won't have any of them answered, but we'll deal with them. Cool. So thanks, Ethan. For the sake of time, let's move on. This has been good. Nice job, guys. I love that game. What's wrong with the argument? It's a fun one. So we all just objected to the argument. Apparently human nature is not good. And so we should all agree with Xunzi. Human nature is bad. So key concepts for Xunzi are, again, Li, ritual. He's a Confucian after all. Deliberate effort, zhe wei, to be contrasted with wu wei, non-action, non-effort. Accumulation and approval. So for Xunzi, human nature is merely constituted by one's selfish and primary desires, which can become the source of chaos if they're not satisfied. I mean, the very first thing that Xunzi tells us in the chapter that I selected for your reading is human nature is bad, and left to your own devices, people live wantonly and do awful things to each other and themselves. For instance, now people's nature is such that they are born with a fondness for profit in them, capitalism. If they follow along with this, then struggle and contention will arise, and yielding and deference will perish therein. They are born with desires of the eyes and ears, a fondness for beautiful sights and sounds. If they follow along with these, then lasciviousness and chaos will arise, and ritual and ye, proper form and order will perish therein. And by the way, Hutton, the guy who translates this, like the academic, like the accepted translation in the literature, is a professor here. So if you want to learn more about this stuff, Utah is one of the best places in the world because of Hutton for doing early Chinese philosophy and some more contemporary stuff. Not totally contemporary, but like compared to this, more contemporary stuff in the Neo-Confucian tradition. Yeah, there's the famous schools for Chinese philosophy are Hawaii, Hong Kong, Utah, and then wherever PJ Ivanhoe is, Chapel Hill maybe, not sure, but like Hawaii has a huge tradition of like being the creative, kind of fun, weird Taoist school, and then yeah, there's sort of like a lineage of ancient Chinese philosophers, and we have like one of the really big ones here through Hutton. So if you're interested in this stuff, like take a class from him. It's a great experience. Okay. If you follow along with your desires, your fondness for profit, your fondness for beautiful sights and sounds, then lasciviousness and chaos will arise, and ritual and in proper order will follow. So what I have here, and again, don't try to read it. It's too small. You can read it later, but it's fun. So it's a 4chan post, unfortunately. It's a good post. But it says the shopping cart is the ultimate litmus test for whether a person is capable of self-governing. To return the shopping cart is an easy, convenient task, and one which we all recognize as the correct, appropriate thing to do. To return the shopping cart is objectively right. There are no situations other than dire emergencies, and maybe not even then, in dire emergencies in which a person is not able to return their cart. Simultaneously, it is not illegal to abandon your shopping cart. Therefore, the shopping cart presents itself as the apex example of whether a person will do what is right without being forced to do it. No one will punish you for not returning the shopping cart. No one will fine you or kill you for not returning the shopping cart. You will gain nothing by returning the shopping cart. You must return the shopping cart out of the goodness of your own heart. You must return the shopping cart because it is the right thing to do, because it is correct. Damn. A person who is unable to do this is no better than an animal, an absolute savage who can only be made to do what is right by threatening them with the law and force that stands behind it.
That's what I was thinking when I was pushing shopping carts back into the grocery store.
Yeah. Yeah, you're working at Smith's. I did the same thing. One of my first jobs was Home Depot and in Oklahoma in the summer. And yeah, it's hot, collecting carts and bringing them in. Yeah, it's awful. So yeah, put them away. The shopping cart is what determines whether a person is a good or bad member of society. And it's almost as if Xunzi, his ghost, inspired this anonymous member of the strangest internet community out there, and like spoke through this person's voice to give us the shopping cart analogy. So what we see is that left to its own devices, to its fondness for profit, shopping cart lasciviousness and chaos will arise. But it is through deliberate effort, says Xunzi. It is by working, it is by training and crafting the human spirit that is naturally bound to chaos, that we can have, oh, there's a cat butt on the Zoom call. My cat does the same thing. So distracting, but like in a good way. Shopping cart chaos. Through deliberate effort, we practice to shift human nature to train us as people, as individuals, to respect the rule of law, of order, of virtue, and being and living well together, so that even in dire conditions, we do what we must, what we ought. Oh. Okay, so ritual is that through which we do this practice, right? That we reshape human nature into something virtuous and good. So in Xunzi's view, ritual was invented by the ancient sage kings to control the chaos which emerged from the evilness, the badness of human nature. From what did ritual arise? I say, humans are born having desires. When they have desires but do not get the objects of their desire, then they cannot but seek some means of satisfaction. If there is no measure or limit to their seeking, then they cannot help but struggle with each other. And if they struggle with each other, then there will be chaos. And if there is chaos, then they will be impoverished. And there's accumulation. So Xunzi believes that a gradual or regular constraint on human nature can transform one's natural state, right? So that we sort of like the baby that's been left on its back too long, his head's gone flat. You put it in a helmet, and the helmet slowly reshapes its head. You don't like squeeze the baby's head so that it rounds out. That's wrong. Don't do that. You put it in a helmet that I'm sorry, I'm not blaming you. You put it in a helmet that slowly applies little bits of pressure and reshapes the deformity of the cartilage as it grows into full skull, right? And this is how you reshape the badness of human nature, similarly by gradually engaging in ritual. So if you accumulate enough earth to form a mountain, then wind and rain will arise from it. If you accumulate enough water to form a deep pool, then dragons will come to live in it. If you accumulate enough goodness to achieve virtue, then you will naturally attain to spirit-like powers and enlightenment, and the heart of a sage is complete therein. And this is to be similar, there's an analogy to be drawn with Aristotle's notion of habituation, which is key to cultivate your virtue, according to Aristotle. So, or your character. So and we'll look at this when we do virtue ethics in a few weeks. But there are all sorts of ethical overlaps between the Confucian school and Aristotle's own form of virtue ethics. So just as like a fun side note. So I don't think that I had you, did you read the passage about carving wood? That might have been in the reading. I think it was maybe in the reading, but it's not here. The idea in Xunzi is that the tree is bent, there's a burl, there's the tree is just sort of naturally deformed. But if you want it to look nice and straight and proper, if you don't want it to be bent and angled, you have to slowly bend it straight. And if you try to force it, it'll crack, right? So Xunzi signifies the cases where people are good, they're exemplified as good through their deliberate effort, not their inherent nature. Allowed to grow naturally, you get like warts and burls and this sort of thing. But carved and shaped, you can become a beautiful wooden sculpture. So it is necessary to await the transforming influence of teachers and models and the guidance of ritual and yi, and only then will come to the yielding and deference, turn to proper form and order, and end up being controlled. Look at it in this way. It is clear that people's nature is bad and their goodness is a matter of deliberate effort. Okay, so by employing deliberate effort slowly and over time, we can reshape humankind to be good, to be the beautiful wooden sculpture. And now we can sort of maybe see why the legalist school that is like ruling with stick and forcing people through like tyranny and aggression and violence to follow the rule of law follows out of Xunzi, right? If human nature is bad and you have to like crack the whip to get people to act right, seems to follow, right? And so you have the legalist school efforts. Side note. Okay, so human nature is bad, an argument formalized. So just like we did with Mengzi, we'll now do with Xunzi. How are we doing on time? Doing okay. It's been like an hour and a half. We're almost at the end. So premise one, if a person tends to do morally bad actions, then they're bad. Whatever causes a person to be bad is also bad, right? That makes sense. If you tell me to do bad things and I do them, then it's kind of your fault too. And that's not good. Okay, so premise three, human nature consists in various innate dispositions and desires that tend to cause people to do various actions. Innately, there are no tendencies in humans to restrain their actions. So as to, wow, I did not do this slide right. There are no tendencies in humans to restrain their actions so as to fulfill their innate dispositions and desires in appropriate ways. And without these restraints, people will tend to do actions that create social and political chaos. social and political chaos are morally bad. Innately, people will tend to do morally bad actions. Innately, people are bad. So human nature is what caused people to be bad innately, and therefore human nature is bad. So it's like I screwed up with the format with all the bullet points. But here's the argument. Is human nature bad?
With premise 2, I think there's plenty of examples of people doing things that might be considered bad for good reasons. Like you might steal food because your baby is starving.
Yeah, and then go to
that's-
prison for 20 years, and then
Yeah.
some girl Cosette becomes really important. And yeah. Yeah, good. So you can do bad things for good reasons. Sure, this is a good objection to premise 2.
Social and political chaos isn't always
Ah,
Oh, it's not.
a deconstructivist, a revolutionary.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
very convenient that like the evil agrarian empire says that political chaos is bad.
Yeah, so like think about it in the context of the historical period that he's coming from. The world is like on fire and at war, and this doesn't have a good effect on like the common people. But I think you're still right, that when we're making arguments about human nature, at least, and it might be anachronistic to reason this way, but you know, you're making a sort of universal claim, and your argument is contextualized to a certain historical period that doesn't quite, the inference isn't itself historically valid. So I think you're right to say that there are cases in which revolution may be justified. And so political and social chaos can end up being a moral good.
I understand the fourth one.
Innately, there are no tendencies in humans to restrain their actions so as to fulfill their innate dispositions and desires in appropriate ways. This is just to say that there's nothing built into us naturally that would cause us to like become good, right? That it's all external stuff. It's ritual, right? It's the example of the sage kings that we have to appropriate into ourselves because we don't have the tools to become good ourselves.
I thought you did think we had the tools to become good. Like have the whole thing about people from the street having like the possibility to become good.
That, yeah, through the appropriation of the ritual and example of the sage kings.
So,
And
sorry.
access to it, sort of.
Yeah, exactly. Everybody has access to it, but you have to like, you have to be in the know, you know?
So would that mean that the sage kings were inherently good?
Yeah. Yeah,
Doesn't that
exactly.
kind of contradict his argument then?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a really good objection too. So there's this huge question when we are evaluating Xunzi, if human nature is bad and we don't innately have built into us the ability to become good, then from whence does ritual, which is the solution to all of this, come? Right. So really good objection. That's a good thought, and a pretty problematic one for Xunzi. But that, you know, that said, sage kings are kind of mythological beings. There's like some historical precedents as far as I understand, but like it is all kind of mythos. And so treating them as kind of magical, godlike entities might be a sort of spiritual way around that. But who knows? It's a good objection.
Question. Does
Sure.
he say that we can't become good? Am I missing that somewhere?
He thinks that you can become good. That's the purpose, but it's just that we're not innately good. And by engaging in like the slow accumulation of edits to behavior and the natural desires that we entertain and have, that we do become good. But innately, without that sort of slow accumulation and training, we are bad.
This argument is much better put together than the previous one. For example, like it says, whatever causes a person to be bad is also bad, which kind of just creates this infinite loop of bad. Like, I don't know what the example you brought up before, but like stealing to feed a baby or something. Like, why is the baby starving? Is that bad? And continuously going back and back until something ends with it being bad. Because for no good, it's hard to wrap my mind around how stealing could ever be good if whatever causes a person to be bad is also bad.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting response. I'm wondering how you might respond to that. Do you have a response?
I didn't think of that. I think that's a really good point. I had an old job doing quality control, and the big part of it was root cause analysis, and that's what this would be. You just say, well, you just have to go back to the root cause, and that's the bad thing. So I actually, that's
Cool.
a really good point.
Yeah, I dig that. So Ethan, you're sort of intuiting what will become a deontological system of ethics, that where what determines what's good or bad is sort of the inception of the inspiration to act in one way or another. So it's an interesting point to say, like, look, even if you're doing it for the right reasons, doing a bad thing is bad, but it may not be your fault. So the moral praise and blameworthiness would go back to the root cause of what led to the system in which a child was starving, which led to you having to steal. None of this is good stuff. And we've said it's a bad thing, right? So it's all just like morally defunct, but maybe necessary. And so we justify it. But what we should really be worried about is the root causes for what's awful. So yeah, I think this is a cool thought. And one that certainly will bump into more when we get to our ethics section.
So my main thing is I feel like he has no, like, at least in the other one, there was an attempt to like prove, well, like basically P3 just has nothing backing it up. Like he starts saying that he just says that people are innately like this. It doesn't really have any proof. Yeah.
The shopping cart example is supposed to be one example, but you might say, look, you can't generalize that from the chaos of things that we do actually lack what Mengzi might call the sprouts. Again, I think Xunzi is inspired by the warring conditions, just seeing everybody in a state of decadence, decline, and self-destruction, and inferring from this to sort of his universal premise. So I get why, given the context, he would argue this way, but I think in principle, you're right, that the empirical context does not make for an unflappable logical principle, right? That is just like deductively true or whatever, right? It has an empirical basis, and if anything has an empirical basis, there's almost always some sort of strange loopy empirical counterexample, at least, right? And maybe even more other counterexamples like children falling in wells and stuff, Hopefully not many children, like, right? Less of that, not more. Anybody else?
Just have a question.
Sure.
I might have missed this, but does he say that accumulation only happens through deliberate effort, or can you like accidentally accumulate?
I don't think you can accidentally into ritual according to Xunzi. I don't know. I'm not sure. But I'm pretty sure that it's like ritual practice is pretty specific
So
for the
it's not,
Confucians,
yeah.
and you wouldn't just accidentally into it. But if you're a Taoist, you would accidentally into it. Okay, so this is the last slide of the lecture, and it's like the last, like I had you read some Taoism. The reason I made this the last slide, rather than like expounding on Taoism, is sort of as a fun experiment for myself, sort of as a reflection and representation of the content of the philosophical school, and then just to sort of see how it goes, because I also knew this would be sort of like at our time limit. But Taoism, all of these philosophers that we've talked about so far are interested in the Tao. Taoism is just the name attributed to this school that is also interested in the Tao. But the way that the Taoists understand the way is the opposite of the Confucians, that one operates through what's called Siran, which is often translated as what is natural. or alternatively, so of itself. So it's not just like, hey, that's a natural chess move, or like that tree is a natural object. It's so of itself. Liu Chaogan from 1970 or 1997, something with paper where he develops this concept. But I like it because it means that what is natural to Siran is like self-moved. It's whatever's like spontaneously produced through the like form of being that thing is, not that like it is a object of nature to be contrasted with humans. No, Ziran is like a principle that can inherit anything. And for the Taoist, the idea of there being human nature that's either good or bad is almost like asking too much. There is human nature, and as long as we let it be what it will, then it will produce what it must. And the question of good or bad is not an important one for the Taoist. What's important is being so of itself, is acting naturally. And it is through this natural form of action of being so of itself, of not forcing things into boxes, into deciding one way or another how one ought to be or what it is to be at all, but rather simply being the bark that floats on the water, right? Allowing you to roll through the current is what forms the state of being and living well. That when we operate well together, it's when we don't overthink it, it's when we don't overdo it, it's when we let ourselves be ourselves, when we act naturally and so of itself. And the sage, the Taoist sage, is the master of this kind of action. So much the master that they can produce, say, like works of philosophy, of poetry, of art, and of storytelling that have a message, even if that message wasn't a matter of deliberate practice and effort, that it's still the product of, say, like the Tao operating through them. For the Taoist sage, as I understand it at least, the Taoist sage is a conduit, is a lightning rod through which the Tao is as an operation, as a moral agential force of being, strikes and operates through, and it's those actions produced by the sage that then are what are most natural and most good, most worthy of being exemplary, and that we follow. And this is the early Chinese symbol for the Tao, natural order. And as I mentioned, the Tao Te Ching is an enigmatic text, even like at face value, but dig any deeper and it gets real strange. There's all sorts of different versions of it. There's about 900 translations. People seem to think that without speaking or reading any early Chinese, having done any formal sinology study, that they can just interpret it for themselves and just get it, which kind of is consistent with the idea, but it means that there's all sorts of awful translations out there that are not even close to respectful of the like original text that we've dug up from Maguandi and Guadon and other archaeological sites. But when you ask the Taoist about human nature, you get probably a big raised eyebrow and maybe a smile, and that's enough, that don't overthink it. Be what you are, and that's what will produce virtue for the Taoist. And yeah, hopefully you saw some of that in what we read from the Tao Te Ching for today. So that's about time. Oh, whoops. There was another meme. There you go. Yeah, next week, optional midterm view, no attendance points. So show up if you want to, show up or don't show up if you don't. I'll be here answering your questions for the midterm. I'll post the midterm on Canvas. You'll have the entire period of time until it's due to do it. So do it well. Come with questions. You could even ask the questions that are asked in the prompt. That's okay too. And it'll be a good sort of like wrap up of what we've learned so far, what we've covered and how we've covered it. And then we'll move on to the second half of class. Thanks, guys.
Joy, just to clarify, next week, there's no attendance points?
Yeah, there's no attendance points next week.